General Hospital spoilers tease that the unexpected confirmation that Ryan Pavey would return to General Hospital as Nathan sent shockwaves across Port Charles, not just among viewers. They threatened to rip apart the fragile balance of power in Port Charles. As he looked at Jason and Britt, there was no hesitation in his voice. He revealed that he had been held for years in an off-grid facility orchestrated by covert agents connected to the WSB and other shadowy figures. But the most chilling truth came when he uttered the name that no one could have anticipated, Drew. The very man Port Charles believed to be reformed, on a path of redemption, was in fact the architect of Nathan's prolonged captivity. Drew, the war hero, the father, the man many had grown to trust again, was now implicated in one of the most twisted and unthinkable betrayals in the show's modern era. What Nathan detailed was not just revenge, it was premeditated psychological warfare. Drew had allegedly used a combination of experimental mind control, isolation, and misinformation to keep Nathan imprisoned, all while manipulating events in Port Charles from behind the scenes. Was a loose end Drew needed to silence permanently. But fate had other plans. And Nathan survived, barely, and he came back not just to reunite with loved ones but to expose the dark empire Drew had been quietly constructing. As the truth began to bleed into the world beyond Five Poppies, Britt struggled to reconcile the man she once cared for with the monster now painted by Nathan's story. Her mind reeled with memories, flashes of times she had defended Drew, moments she questioned his intensity, and now, retroactively, signs she had ignored. Jason's response was less conflicted. For him, this was confirmation of what he had long suspected. Drew's increasingly erratic behavior, his aggressive need for control, and his recent outbursts against Scout, Alexis, and even Carly were no longer isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper, darker transformation. The Drew they knew was long gone. In his place was someone capable of grand, manipulative schemes, someone willing to trade in the lives and sanity of others for his own twisted redemption arc. As word spread throughout Port Charles, tensions ignited like wildfire. Maxie, overwhelmed and uncertain, couldn't bring herself to believe or deny the story. Liesel, sensing the truth in Nathan's eyes, grew protective and prepared for the fallout. Sam, torn between her complicated past with both Drew and Jason, found herself trapped in emotional purgatory. And Carly, the ever-pragmatic, ever-loyal, now found herself questioning the very alliances she had forged in recent months. Drew, unaware at first of Nathan's return, soon began to feel the walls closing in. Whispered rumors, strange glances, coded warnings from allies, it all began to erode his carefully constructed mask. But rather than retreat, he doubled down. As pressure mounted, Drew's paranoia deepened. And his tactics grew more dangerous. Surveillance of his former friends, attempts to silence those close to Nathan, even covert sabotage against WSB assets, all of it pointed to a man unraveling. And the more he tried to contain the situation, the more visible his guilt became. Five Poppies, once a secretive staging ground for clandestine activity, now became the epicenter of reckoning. Nathan's return transformed the location from a shadowy refuge into a battlefield of truth. Jason began orchestrating operations to gather evidence. Britt, emboldened by her own moral code, began digging into Drew's WSB connections. Sonny, sensing that another empire was about to collapse, moved with caution, re-evaluating his trust in former allies. The tide was shifting. And in the eye of that storm stood Nathan, a man reborn not just through survival, but through the unshakable clarity of justice. His return wasn't simply personal, it was a symbol of accountability. A reminder that no lie stays buried forever. Yet beneath the chaos, the looming question remained, what would happen if Drew decided to strike first? With the threat of exposure breathing down his neck, and the knowledge that Nathan had returned to tear apart everything he'd rebuilt, Drew stood on the edge of a new kind of warfare, one that would threaten not just his legacy, but the lives of every person who dared challenge him. And if he were to fall, he would not go down quietly. There would be collateral damage. There would be vengeance. The darkness was far from over. Shall I continue with what happens next after Nathan's return shakes the town? In Port Charles, he wore the mask of a caring father, a reformed soldier, a man of purpose. But behind that carefully curated facade was a secret so dark, so deeply entrenched in selfishness and manipulation, that when it finally cracked open, it sent shockwaves through every corner of the town. The revelation that Scout, believed by all to be Drew Kane's daughter, was in fact the biological child of Jason Morgan, shattered the illusion of stability Drew had clung to. And it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a deliberate deception, a calculated act of identity theft, emotionally weaponized against the very people he claimed to love. And grief. It was in that fog of emotional vulnerability that Drew found an opportunity, one he took without hesitation. While others mourned Jason, Drew quietly erased him. And with him, Jason's role in Scout's life. He falsified birth records, forged court documents, and used Jason's disappearance to plant his own legacy in the soil that never belonged to him. He rewrote Scout's history, not for the child's benefit, but for his own hunger to belong, to possess a piece of the life he never had. The web of lies grew larger with every passing year. And by the time Jason miraculously returned, the damage had already taken root. When the truth came out, it didn't come softly. It erupted. Leaked documents surfaced, DNA retests were ordered. And whispers turned into screams. Scout was not Drew's biological daughter. She was Jason's. The man she'd called Dad had stolen her birthright, her identity. Alexis, who had legally supported Drew's guardianship, was horrified to learn that her professional integrity had been used as a tool for deception. She had fought legal battles on Drew's behalf, believing in his sincerity. Now she realized she had been manipulated like everyone else. Jason's reaction was quieter, but more lethal. The stoic enforcer, long known for his cold exterior and emotional restraint, now stared down the man who had stolen his daughter's life and buried his name in silence. The betrayal cut deeper than words. It was not just about parentage. It was about memory, trust, and identity, about a brother who had taken more than just his place in the world, but had tried to erase him entirely. Jason's silence became a signal to others, this was war. And it wasn't just personal. It was about correcting a wrong that had festered for far too long. Port Charles erupted in judgment. Friendships fractured. Allegiances shifted. Carly was stunned, and for once, left without words. Sonny, long a master manipulator himself, quietly began to sever ties. Recognizing in Drew the same hunger for power and control he had seen in his own enemies. Scout, caught in the middle, was devastated. She had been lied to her entire life. Everything she believed about her father, her history, her family, it was all tainted now. Her pain became the town's pain. A symbol of how one man's desperation had broken more than just laws, it had broken people. Drew, cornered and exposed, began to unravel. He tried to explain, to twist the narrative, to justify his actions as ones born from love and protection. But the more he spoke, the more monstrous he became. His justifications were hollow. His expressions of regret were seen as performative. He was not the victim, no matter how much he wanted to play that role. In every conversation, every press conference, every courtroom declaration, Drew revealed just how far he was willing to go to rewrite his own past, even if it meant hijacking someone else's future. The fallout extended beyond emotion. Legal proceedings were initiated. Sam filed to remove Drew's name from Scout's birth certificate. Jason, with mounting public support, sought full custody. Alexis was investigated for unknowingly legitimizing forged paperwork. Drew was subpoenaed, questioned, and eventually indicted on charges of fraud, falsification of documents, and identity theft. His once loyal allies, like Curtis and Nina, began distancing themselves. His business holdings suffered. Public trust eroded. But the most haunting consequence was internal. Drew began to lose control of his own narrative. He had spent so long crafting a version of himself that others could admire, a hero, a father, a survivor. Now, all that remained was the truth. That he had built his redemption on a foundation of stolen lives and broken trust. The walls closed in. He became paranoid, defensive, angry. He lashed out at Sam, blamed Jason, accused Alexis, and denied Scout's heartbreak. But no amount of shouting could drown out the truth that had finally come to light. And Scout? She became the most powerful voice of all. Quiet at first, she withdrew. But in time, her silence became strength. She confronted Drew, not with anger, but with clarity. She told him that he had taken something from her that she could never get back. That she needed time, space, and the truth. And then she walked away. From him. From the lie. From the illusion of the father who never really was. In the end, Drew stood alone. His empire crumbled. His relationships disintegrated. And his legacy, once so carefully crafted, was reduced to a cautionary tale. A man who tried to steal another's life and ended up destroying his own. The world he had built collapsed around him, not because of fate, or bad luck, or misunderstanding, but because of the choices he made, the truths he buried, and the innocence he stole. The story of Drew Kane became one of the greatest tragedies Port Charles had ever witnessed, not because of what he lost, but because of what he was never truly willing to face, the truth. Would you like a continuation from Scout's point of view next? Jason had faced many battles in his life, against the criminal underworld, against loss, against the darkness of his own past, but nothing compared to the war that now waged inside him. The revelation that Drew, his long-lost twin, was not only a threat but potentially not even Drew at all sent Jason spiraling into a torment he could neither process nor ignore. For months, Jason had watched as Drew's behavior shifted. As the man who once stood beside him in battle, who had earned a place of cautious respect, began unraveling into something cold, calculating, and disturbingly manipulative. But it wasn't until Nathan returned from the shadows, his survival a miracle, his knowledge a bombshell, that the pieces began to align into a horrifying truth. Nathan, long believed dead, revealed something no one could have anticipated. The man everyone believed to be Drew was, in fact, Peter August, alive, surgically altered, and impersonating the one person who could gain access to secrets, families, and trust without resistance. The real Drew, Nathan insisted, had been dead for years, his disappearance not a mystery, but a cover-up orchestrated by Peter himself. It was the ultimate act of psychological warfare, a monster hiding in plain sight, cloaked in the image of a hero. For Jason, this wasn't just betrayal. It was personal annihilation. To accept this truth meant to face the reality that he had not only failed to protect his brother, but had allowed his enemy into the very heart of his life. Peter, wearing Drew's face, had manipulated Scout, violated Sam's trust, and infiltrated every layer of Port Charles. He had rewritten history, altered DNA records, staged emotional scenes, and planted lies so deeply that not even those closest to Drew had questioned them. And now, Jason had to consider the unthinkable, that to save everyone he loved, and to frame him for the collapse that Peter himself had engineered. But Jason, fueled by raw determination, began tracking Peter's every move, collecting data, seeking proof, not just for the world, but for himself. He needed certainty before he acted. Because if he pulled that trigger, if he ended the life of the man masquerading as Drew, he would never come back from it. Port Charles became a city suspended in paranoia and disbelief. Anna, torn between her past connection to Peter and her allegiance to truth, quietly began aiding Jason. Nathan, operating from the shadows, fed intelligence to Spinelli and Britt. Carly and Sam formed a reluctant alliance, both shaken by the possibility that the man they each loved had never truly come home. And Scout, caught in the eye of the storm, grew distant, sensing that the father she trusted had become someone else entirely. The final confrontation neared with each revelation. Peter, sensing the walls closing in, grew more erratic. He began eliminating those who knew too much, starting with lesser associates and working his way up. He cornered Nathan, threatened Spinelli. Haunted by the possibility that justice would demand more than a bullet, it would demand the burial of the man who wore his brother's face. And yet, through the haze of grief, guilt, and rage, one truth remained constant: Drew deserved justice. Not vengeance. Not revenge. But truth. And Jason would stop at nothing to deliver it, even if it meant killing a ghost. Even if it meant destroying what remained of his own soul. Because the lie had gone too far, and the only way to end it was with fire. Whose silence has always spoken louder than words, now moves with terrifying precision, his every step a challenge to the twisted world Drew has built. But this Drew, this imposter cloaked in a brother's memory, is unraveling. The man once believed to be a brother now stands exposed under a shadow of suspicion, where every word, every glance, every carefully orchestrated manipulation is no longer protected by familiarity. The weight of the truth, Nathan's revelation, Britt's survival, and Jason's unwavering determination, begins to crush the false identity Drew had constructed for so long. The town begins to see the cracks. Scout's disillusionment, Sam's cautious distance, Carly's growing rage, and Sonny's forced neutrality all signal a slow implosion that Drew can feel pressing against his spine. What Jason brings back is more than just allies, it's evidence. Britt, having lived in forced exile, carries with her documentation, memories, and scars of what was done to preserve Peter's secrets. Nathan, returning from the dead, holds the pieces of a conspiracy that stretches beyond identity theft into the darkest corridors of WSB corruption. And Jason, driven not only by loyalty but by a need for justice, is ready to bring it all to light, no matter how devastating the consequences. For Drew, or the man masquerading as him, this signals the collapse of his carefully built illusion. The adjustments he scrambles to make now are manic, desperate. The once subtle manipulations become overt acts of aggression. Lies become threats. And the calm mask he wore begins to contort into something monstrous. He begins pushing back, hard, launching preemptive strikes to protect the empire he's stolen. Legal documentation begins to disappear. Whistleblowers vanish. Threats are issued to anyone standing near Jason or Britt or Nathan. But the trio refuse to back down. Jason's war is not only physical but deeply psychological. The more the truth emerges, the more it reshapes everything. This isn't just about exposing a fraud. It's about rewriting years of emotional entanglement, about restoring identities that were stolen, and confronting the moral weight of vengeance when it wears the face of family. Jason does not want to destroy his brother. But when he looks into Drew's eyes now, he no longer sees his brother. He sees Peter, methodical, remorseless, and dangerous. The town begins to fracture between those still clinging to what they believed and those who now see the horrific tapestry being torn apart at the seams. Peter, pretending to be Drew, begins to lose his grip. His paranoia escalates. His threats become wild. He starts isolating Scout, manipulating her trust, trying to erase the past before it consumes him. He begins crafting counter-narratives, fabricating conspiracies, painting Jason as the real enemy, but the web is collapsing faster than he can spin. The madness becomes visible. The danger becomes palpable. And the truth, now exposed like a raw nerve, demands justice. What was once a cold war of suspicion explodes into a full-blown battle for truth and legacy. Jason is no longer fighting just to expose Peter. He is fighting to reclaim his family, to protect Scout from psychological ruin, to give Sam back her peace. To free Port Charles from the grip of a lie so deeply embedded it almost became truth. He is fighting for Drew's memory. And Britt, forever marked by betrayal and suffering, stands at Jason's side. Not just as a survivor, but as a warrior ready to ensure no one else falls victim to Peter's manipulations. Nathan, with the clarity of the grave behind him, becomes the symbol of everything that was lost and must be restored. This war becomes more than personal. It becomes historic. The Corinthos family fractures under the weight of revelation. The WSB is forced to answer for its involvement. And as Peter's mask shatters under Jason's unrelenting pursuit, Port Charles stands at the edge of a transformation it may never recover from.